Watershed moments, okay. Watershed moments are defining moments in history and in life. And so what we're going to do today is we are going to look at a retrospective of history from what I believe are defining moments for this generation. And maybe that's a little too broad, this generation. Maybe I'll just say what I believe are defining moments for me. How does that sound? And maybe some of you will be able to relate to that. Defining moments that have defined this current generation. We're going to start from the present, 2023, and we're going to go back in time. And we're going to compare those defining moments that have defined our generation today, and maybe compare that with the defining moments that defined the generation of the founders, of the pioneers of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. Does that sound good? Okay, all right, so here we go. 2023, we're starting in the present. We are the products of the world around us. We are who we are, and our values and our outlook and our perspective is largely shaped and influenced by the events that have unfolded before and during our time. I call these watershed moments that define our generation. So here we are, retrospective, starting in this year. What defines our reality today? Let me name a few things, and maybe I missed a few things here. Polarization in our country. Yes or no? Polarization in our country. Economic recession and inflation, our current reality. Housing market crisis, shortages. Labor shortages, supply shortages, politics. All right, let's move on. War, Ukraine and Russia, and just recently, while we were worshiping here, maybe some of us were even unaware, Israel and the Palestinians have engaged in war at this time. What defines our current generation? Technology, social media, the entertainment industry, the evolution of sexual ethics, or the revolution of sexual ethics, defines our current reality. How do we get here? All right, so let's take a trip 3 years ago. What did I put on there? 3 years ago. Almost 4 years ago. How many of you remember, I call this a watershed moment. How many of you remember 4 years ago, this virus called COVID? And immediately, almost overnight, within a few days, there were mandates, and there were shutdowns, and then there were quarantines, and then there was war and a battle over vaccines, and controversy over the origins of the coronavirus, and a lack of trust in our institutions, and even it affected and changed the way we do church, the way we do school. Millions died. That was only 3 years ago. All right, let's keep going back a little bit further. Watershed moments. 15 years ago. Now that number is important, so I'll put the year at the top, and then I'll put how many years ago it's been since today. And that bottom number is, I think, important. So you'll see two numbers on there, the year, and then you'll see another number, which is the difference between today and that year. Can you believe it was only 15 years ago that we found ourselves in a housing market crisis? Can you believe that? I mean, it felt like we were just getting out of it, didn't it? I mean, that's what I felt like. We were just getting out of it, and we're back into it again. Cycles. We'll talk a little bit about cycles later on in our sermon. Watershed moments, defining moments of this generation. All right, let's go back a few years after that. Let's go back maybe 20, 22 years. Watershed moments, defining moments in the history of our country here. When I was doing the math, I realized, even though it's been 22 years ago, I realized in the third generation that I think you have to be, correct me if I'm wrong here, I think you have to be at least maybe 28 years old today to remember what happened in 2001. Isn't that something? You have to be at least 28 years old, 29, maybe 30 years old today. That means there's a whole generation today, 30 and under, that didn't, I mean, they were there, they were alive, but they don't remember. They didn't go through it. We're all getting old. Let's go back a few more years. 22 years ago, let's go back a few more years. I remember this one here. I was just a kid, though, but I remember when the Berlin Wall fell in 1989 and communism, fell shortly thereafter in the 90s. That was only 34 years ago. Can you imagine that? You know, and I remember I was just a kid, but I had this sense of optimism when I saw that in the news. Anybody else? I had a sense of optimism. I was like, okay, our great enemy has finally been defeated. And I had a sense of optimism for about 10 years until this happened, right? And then there was a sense of pessimism that's been with me. The outlook of our world here since that. It was only 34 years ago, 1989, defining moments. All right, let's go back a little bit further. 48 years ago. Not that long ago. Now, I wasn't alive back then, but I remember the Vietnam War being the defining war of my generation and growing up and hearing all about this pointless war that we fought for 20 years. Does that sound familiar? Cycles. Didn't we just get out of a 20-year war that went nowhere in the Middle East? I remember seeing this picture when I was a kid, and it just leaving an impression on me, that little girl, and I forget what her name is, but she's still alive. I think she's in her 50s. She immigrated to Canada. When I was at Southern Adventist University, they brought her to speak to us at one of our university convocations. If you want to Google Napalm Girl, and you can hear all about her story. That was only 48 years ago, 1975, only 48 years ago, the more defining moments that have characterized our generation. All right, I'm going to go back even a little further. Watershed moments. Can you believe that? 59 years ago. Now this still, I was not alive then, but 59 years ago still does not seem that long ago to me. Anybody else can give me a witness on that one? Amen? 59 years ago was not. We would have drinking fountains that were labeled white and drinking fountains that were labeled color. Just 59 years ago, the civil rights movement, defining moments in this generation. All right, let's go back. It probably doesn't feel like it was that long ago. World War II, entering into the potential and finally, a little bit further, 1933 and the Great Depression, which our recessions in our day are still always compared back to the Great Depression 90 years ago. All right, let's recap that here. Defining moments, watershed moments that define our generation. And I'm sure I missed some. You can think about some others that maybe I missed. But let's look now and compare some of the watershed moments that defined the generation that ultimately established the Seventh-day Adventist Church. Those men and women that established the Seventh-day Adventist Church, they grew up in a particular time in history, and it feels like it was such a long time ago, 1844. Right? It feels like it was such a long time ago. But what were the defining moments that characterized this generation that led to establish the Seventh-day Adventist Church? Now, if you're new to the Seventh-day Adventist Church, 1844 is a defining moment, not just in our church, but in American history as well. What took place in 1844 was the culmination of the Great Awakening. Especially the last part was defined by Millerism, which is a movement in the belief that Jesus is coming soon. And they felt that Jesus was going to return in the year 1844. Of course, he didn't, but that was a defining moment. Not just, in fact, there weren't even Adventists back then. This was a interdenominational movement. I want to say it was an ecumenical movement. But William Miller was a Baptist. He wasn't a Seventh-day Adventist. Seventh-day Adventist wasn't a thing in 1844. William Miller was a Baptist preacher, and many of the preachers in this movement were Methodist and Presbyterian. Some of them were even from the Christian Connection, which is their version of non-denominational churches of their day. And so this was a movement that took place. It didn't happen in a corner. It took place in the U.S. It took place around the world. It was a worldwide movement believing that Jesus would return in the year 1844. And so what defined, and it was out of the disappointment of 1844 that the Seventh-day Adventist Church arose. So what is it that defined this generation of individuals who believed this and ultimately established the Seventh-day Adventist Church? Are you ready? Retrospective? From 1844 and back. Are you ready? 4 years ago from 1844. I know some of you are looking at it and are like, what? That's the Ottoman Empire. Who? Other known as the Turks. What? We don't know about was an empire that ruled, all the area in the green, they ruled it for about 600 years. It was largely a Muslim, Turkish empire. If you notice, they even went into what would you call that? Southeastern Europe. Do you see that there? Greece. I remember going to Greece some years ago, and the Greeks still don't like the Turks. I don't know if you know that. People from Turkey, they still don't like them. There's a reason that took place. See that? Do you see that there, Jerusalem? In 1840, beginning of the decline of the Ottoman Empire. This Ottoman Empire, who had been a threat to Europe for 100 years, the Renaissance and the Reformation and the Reform, enemy, and they were the enemy of Europe, and we know that they went up even into Spain. Maybe I don't know if I should say this or not. Go to Europe and ask Europeans how they feel about Muslims. There's a history there. What happened in 1840 is that for the very first time in 600 years, the Ottoman Empire, they asked countries of West and to help them. 1840 of the decline of the Ottoman Empire. And why it's important is because there was a gentleman who was preaching in the Second Great Awakening, and he said that the Ottoman Empire, based on prophecies, that the Ottoman Empire would come to an end in the year 1840. Isn't that interesting? The Ottoman Empire is going to fall on August 11 of 1840, the Ottoman Empire. You're telling me, okay, all right. It's a pity. I wanted to move around. Okay. Now, what's interesting about this is that people in those days, they felt that it was the fulfillment of prophecy of the book of Revelation, that the Ottoman Empire now was not, and it began its decline. And it continued to decline until World War I. And World War I, the Ottoman Empire decided to join the losing side of World War I. As a result of choosing the losing side, its territory was broken up, and that little area where the city called Jerusalem was taken over by England, by Great Britain, and then after World War II, England was in control of that area, and it decided to give that area back to the Jews and to create the modern state of Israel. Isn't that interesting? Creating the current controversy that we have today. 1840, watershed moments. Just 4 years before 1844. All right, let's keep going back. Watershed moments that defined the pioneers, that generation that established the Seventh-day Adventist Church. Here goes. Let's go back here a few more years. 11 years before 1844. You had this meteor shower, the Leonid meteor shower. They say that you could see up to 100,000 meteors falling every hour. In fact, many people believed that what they saw there was the fulfillment of this prophecy in Matthew chapter 24, where Jesus says, "At that time the sun will be darkened, and the moon will not give its light, and the stars will fall from the sky." Now, that was a long time ago. It was at 1833. What's the big deal? What I find interesting about what's the big deal about this is that I will come across articles on the internet that are still referencing this meteor shower, different science articles. This was a turning point, a watershed moment in the history of that particular generation. This will, I follow, I'm on Twitter, and I follow these astronomy and science accounts, and they're constantly, things like this are still popping up. About 1833, indeed, it was a big deal. All right, let's go back a little bit further. Let's go back a little bit further from that. And that was just 11 years prior to 1844. Watershed moments. Here's another one. 32 years before 1844. Again, what was 32 years from 2023? What was that? Help me out. 32 years from 2023. What year were we in there? 32 years. Where were we at? We're in the late, what was that? I heard late 80s, early 90s. Not that long ago, right? 32 years ago? Not that long ago. 32 years before 1844. Believe it or not, the War of 1812. The British burned the White House. How many of you remember that? How many of you remember that, studying that in history? Not that long from that generation of 1844, the people who are going to establish our church, the Seventh-day Adventist Church, still have this in mind. The British invading our country, the British burning down the White House. It was our country was still in an infancy at that time. Florida, let me see here, 1812. Florida would be established as a territory 10 years after this in 1822. The Wild West in the U.S. was still a thing. These are defining moments in that generation that established the Seventh-day Adventist Church. Let's go back a little bit more. 46 years ago, from 1844. You say we're going back 46 years from 1844. Again, where were we 46 years ago from 2023? Where were we again? Vietnam War, 1970s, not that long ago, right? Let me see a few other things that were happening in the 1970s, 46 years ago. Roe versus Wade, 1972, I think. The Arab oil embargo, how many of you remember that? Not that long ago. I don't like referencing pop culture, but Jaws, 1975, not that long ago, right? Star Wars, 1977, not that long ago, 46 years ago. 46 years ago for that Adventist, that generation that established the Seventh-day Adventist Church, the French Revolution, not that long ago for them. In 1798, not that long ago. The Reign of Terror, where everybody's heads were being chopped off. No evidence, just if there was a suspicion, your head, off with your head, be chopped off. Napoleon, not that long ago, potentially a contemporary of some of that generation that established the Seventh-day Adventist Church. General Berthier, who went to the Vatican and took the Pope captive. During that time, contemporaries there of that, some of that generation that established the Seventh-day Adventist Church not that long ago. In fact, you know, when I mentioned 1798, I mentioned General Berthier, I mentioned, him going over and taking the Pope captive. And I would always hear these things. How many of you have heard that before in a Revelation seminar? You've heard that before, right? Revelation seminar, Daniel seminar, evangelistic series. And then I found myself in the Vatican Museum a few years ago, before COVID. And I was taking that tour down the Vatican Museum, and we came across a hall in the Vatican Museum, and it said, if you look to the right, there's this long hall. It's one of the newer additions to the Vatican Museum. This hall was built to exhibit all the sculptures and all the busts and whatever else they have in there. All the things that General Berthier, when he came in 1798, when he came and took the Pope captive, he took all this with him as booty over to France. And several years, probably in the 1800s, once relations between France and the Vatican had calmed down, the Vatican sent a message over to France and said, hey, do you remember when General Berthier was here and he ransacked the Vatican and then he took all these sculptures? Do you guys mind giving that back to us? It belongs to us. And by that time, France said, oh, sure, yeah, we'll give it back to you. And so they gave it all back to them, and then they built this hall there in the Vatican Museum, and you can see some of the sculptures there that they put there. All the things that General Berthier had taken. Again, for me, you hear this in a Revelation seminar, Daniel Revelation seminar, but when you actually go there and you see it and people tell you about it, it becomes real. Are you following me, Newport Richie? Watershed moments that defined the generation that established the Seventh-day Adventist Church 46 years from 1844. All right, let's go back a little bit more. 1780. 68 years. Was that 64 years from 1844? Again, not that long ago. 64 years from 2023, we were in the middle, again, of the civil rights movement. We were in the middle of the Cuban Missile Crisis. Anybody else remember that? We were in the middle of the assassination of John F. Kennedy, which, fascinating enough, right? The U.S. government has just released all kinds of documents about an event that took place about 64 years ago. Not that long ago, in 1780, there was, again, this what they call the Dark Day of New England. And what I find fascinating, again, is that this will come up on my Twitter feed about what took place. You know, this is still a big deal. It's not just for Daniel and Revelation seminars or Adventists only. This is a defining moment, a watershed moment in the history of our world. Not only that, but what's fascinating, and people believe that this was a fulfillment of Matthew 24, where he says the sun will be darkened, the moon will turn to blood. It took place there in 1780. What's interesting about this is that happens, if you know your history, that happens in the middle of the U.S. Revolutionary War. Isn't that fascinating? We're fighting for our country, establishing our country, and in the middle of our war for independence, the sun is darkened and the moon is turned into blood. Isn't that fascinating? Let's push it back just a little bit. 1776. Again, 68 years from 1844, watershed moments that defined the generation that established the Seventh-day Adventist Church, the U.S. independence, July 4, 1776. For that generation of 1844, not that long ago. And then finally, pushing it back maybe a little bit further back, 89 years from 1844. Again, similar to, I think, was this the Great Depression for us of the 1930s. For that generation that established the Seventh-day Adventist Church, 1755, the Lisbon earthquake, 90,000 people perished within those first few days. When you read the accounts of it, it said that after that earthquake hit, the ocean went back on itself. Doesn't that sound familiar? And then it came right back in, they say about 80 feet high or so, and it just crashed and devastated the city of Lisbon. And again, what's the big deal about this? Well, many people in those days, they felt that this was the fulfillment of prophecy. In Revelation chapter 6, there's this prophecy about the sixth seal. It said, "And I watched as he opened the sixth seal, and there was a great earthquake. The sun turned black, the whole moon turned blood red, and the stars in the sky fell to earth." So as that generation is witnessing this happening almost in sequence, the Lisbon earthquake, the dark day of New England, the stars falling to the sky, they're sensing that God is doing something. They're sensing that Bible prophecy is being fulfilled through these events. Now, again, what's the big deal about this? We're going to show this one here, and just randomly. What's the big deal about the Lisbon earthquake? Happened in 1755, so long ago, and yet again in my news feed, I get this. It's a reenactment of the 1755 Lisbon tsunami. Can we push play to just take a look at the extent of this earthquake tsunami? You know, when I look at this, you know, we may not think it's relevant for us anymore. We may think it's just something that we've heard a long time ago in a Daniel and Revelation seminar. But again, I find it fascinating that scientists still feel that this is relevant, that scientists are still putting out models about the dark day, about the falling of the stars in 1833. These were watershed defining moments that defined the lives of the pioneers, of the men and the women that established our Seventh-day Adventist Church. These are those events. And what it did is it gave our founders of the Seventh-day Adventist Church, it gave us an eschatological perspective. That is, an apocalyptic awareness and a consciousness grounded in the Bible and biblical prophecy. And as they're seeing all this taking place in their time, in their generation, they're recognizing that Bible prophecy is being fulfilled, that God is at work, that something is happening. Dare I say that they had this consciousness and this awareness that they were living in the end of time. If this is the the time period of the earth, the history of the earth. This is the beginning over here on the left. This is the end on the right. They had this awareness that they're living over here somewhere. Our Adventist pioneers. Do you see that? Because of the events that were taking place. It gave them an eschatological perspective, an apocalyptic awareness, and a consciousness grounded in the Bible and biblical prophecy. That is, they were aware that they were living in the end of time. They were aware of the signs that would bring on the end of time, namely economic collapse. Does that sound familiar? Namely anger among the nations. Does that sound familiar? Gross moral decay, horrific natural disasters, pandemics, the rise of intolerance, the rise of zealotry, the rise of restrictions, and the removal of freedom. Now, when I shared that with somebody a few years ago, they told me, Pastor, but that's been all the time. We've seen that all the time in history. And I said, yes, we have. Because we believe that these signs, this is important, these signs are cyclical and these signs are generational. That is, every generation experiences these signs. And we're seeing it happening over and over and over again. Every generation experiences these signs. And these signs, when we experience these signs, it is an opportunity for us to recognize the futility and the hopelessness of the human condition. And as a result, instead of turning towards pessimism and towards cynicism, as a result, as we see the futility and the hopelessness of the human condition, even with all our technology and all our knowledge and all our advancements in science, when we recognize the futility and hopelessness of the human condition, as a result, hopefully it can turn our attention to God and to hope and to meaning and to joy and to peace and to a preferred future. Newport Richie. But not only are these signs cyclical and generational, these signs are also exponential and compounding. That is, every time we go through these, these signs, every time we experience what we're experiencing today, it will be harder and harder on us. It will be harder and harder to recover from it until finally it will get to a breaking point where the world will no longer be able to endure it or bear it, and it will implode on itself. Society will collapse, and that's what the Bible calls the fall of Babylon. But at that time, Luke chapter 21, verse 28, it's on your bulletin here. It says, when these things begin to take place, stand up. Stand up, it says. Stand up, lift up your heads. Lift them up. Newport Richie, I want to say stand up right now. I want to say stand up. That wasn't, stand up, go ahead, stand up. Lift up your heads. Get ready for the closing song. Stand up, lift up your heads. Because your redemption draws nigh.